and I'd like to turn this over to Chairman Calogne to give his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to read the recommendation memo from the committee to the trustees, and then I'll follow that up with a few brief remarks on behalf of the committee. The trustees are being requested today to accept the report of the Brattle Group and M.J. Beck related to LIPA's future business structure and to adopt the recommendations set forth therein. Last year, LIPA engaged the Brattle Group to review certain alternative organizational structures for the operation of LIPA upon the expiration in 2013 of its current management services agreement with National Grid, and to make a recommendation to LIPA's trustees with respect thereto. The board's goal is to determine the optimal organizational structure to assure, to the greatest extent possible, low-cost, reliable electric services to LIPA's customers in the long term. In that regard, the Brattle Group was asked to focus their analysis on three organizational options. Privatization, whereby LIPA would sell its assets and business to a private enterprise. Municipalization, whereby the workforce would be transferred to a governmental organization, the existing LIPA organization. And a public-private hybrid, whereby a private entity would provide management services to LIPA through a dedicated operating subsidiary and workforce. In addressing these options, the Brattle Group was expected to consider best practices for both publicly held and investor-owned utilities, the evolution of the energy industry in New York and surrounding areas, and the views of all stakeholders. Specifically with respect to each option, the Brattle Group was responsible for evaluating issues and potential benefits, including operational, financial, ratepayer, environmental, implementation, and feasibility issues. They looked at short and long-term anticipated costs. They looked at enterprise and other risks, financial, operational, structural, and practical impediments, rate impacts over a 10-year period, a timeline for achieving any change, and the ability to realize policy objectives under any of these structures. Over the past 16 months, Brattle has conducted an extensive review, the results of which were made public this past July and further codified in the final report issued this month. The Brattle study sets forth in great detail the nature and extent of the analysis conducted, which included, among other things, developing a baseline for LIPA's cost structure and revenue requirements against which each of the organizational options was compared. They used empirical data regarding LIPA's costs and performance to benchmark LIPA against other utilities. They assessed recent utility reorganizations and related cost implications, and they created appropriate cost and other projections to determine potential future results. The study, as the trustees are well aware, sets forth high and low cost scenarios and surrounding a mid-case scenario related to each of the three options to address a meaningful range of possibilities and risk from a financial and operational perspective. The Brattle study recommends that the trustees adopt the service provider model based on their key findings and conclusions, which are that the cost and rate impact analysis finds that implementation of the privatization option under LIPA's existing capital structure would result in a rate increase of 10 to 20% for LIPA's customers. The overall costs associated with the service provider and municipalization options, as well as their associated impacts on average electric rates, are roughly equal. However, there's implementation risk is higher under the municipalization option than under the service provider option. The service provider option would capture some of the benefits of privatization while preserving the financing advantages of public tax-exempt debt. And the service provider approach would provide flexibility with respect to transferability of employees and assets in the future. As the study further relates, some of the additional improvements to be realized in a service provider model over the current business model include increased transparency, more control over staffing, and the ability for LIPA ratepayers to benefit from any operational savings. The trustees, particularly the Operations Committee, have engaged in numerous and extensive briefings related to Brattle's scope of work. The committee has spent a considerable amount of time reviewing and analyzing Brattle's findings and probed their assumptions and projections, as well as the resulting scenarios created for each of the three options studied. The committee has also interacted with elected officials and the public to address ideas and questions raised by various stakeholders in order to ensure that Brattle's analysis considered all appropriate perspectives and potential scenarios. In light of the committee's careful examination of the Brattle study and the consideration of all the public comments received related to that analysis, the committee has reached a consensus that we recommend to the board that the Brattle Group study has concluded that the best strategic option available to LIPA's customers at this time is the public-private option, and at this time that conclusion should be adopted by the trustees. Based on that, the committee recommends approval of the resolution that you all have in your board books, that we proceed with the service provider model. That ends the formal reading of the recommendation memo, but let me add a few additional thoughts from the Operations Committee's perspective for the board. As you all know, for the last 10 months, on behalf of the trustees and our fellow ratepayers, the Operations Committee has collectively spent hundreds of hours working with the Brattle Group and other experts to review the structural options for LIPA's future. Because of the importance of this decision, the board set up this review process to be more inclusive and open than any previous decision in LIPA's history. We've had full public updates at 4 board meetings, 3 trustee workshops which are open to the public, 2 workshops for elected officials, 3 additional public briefings with public comment and questions, all of which has resulted in input from dozens and dozens of our fellow ratepayers and insightful analysis by community leaders, some of them here in this room, and others who've improved our deliberations. This board said from the beginning that a process that is as open to the public as possible is not just desirable here, it is essential. While only this board of ratepayers can make the ultimate decisions, it's been important that our minds haven't been the only ones applied to these issues, and our voices haven't been the only ones heard. Now, at the end of the road, I think we would all agree that we are better for having done this together. This process started 18 months ago when the board determined that the current structure of LIPA, put in place more than a decade ago, was not working to the maximum benefit of ratepayers. LIPA needs a new way forward. The trustees hired the Brattle Group, renowned utility strategic consultants, to help determine that best structure, and the Brattle Group has looked at those 3 reorganization options, as we've indicated, through 2 general frames. What is the financial impact on us as ratepayers, and what are the transition and operational risks? After this year of work and numerous meetings and discussions with the Operations Committee as well as the full board, the Brattle Group finalized and published their conclusions 3 months ago, and we've released additional backup materials in the full report publicly over the last 2 months. The Brattle Group's conclusion, and ours, is that the ServCo model is the best path forward for 1, keeping rates as low as possible by maintaining the cheapest cost of capital for debt and future capital expenditures. 2, taking advantage of private sector operating efficiencies. 3, minimizing transition and operational risks by having an experienced private sector utility operator help run the T&D system and implement replacements to the current antiquated computer systems. And 4, maintaining the option of changing to a full municipal or a privatization model should future circumstances make those options more favorable to ratepayers. It's been noted that of the 3 restructuring alternatives, the service provider or ServCo model is the one most similar to the current arrangement that clearly needs fixing. And that is true. But there are dozens of significant critical differences between the current MSA structure and the new service provider structure. For example, under the current structure, vendor staff can be split between LIPA and non-LIPA responsibilities. Under the new structure, staffing is dedicated to LIPA. Under the current structure, LIPA does not control operations and systems budgets. Under the new structure, LIPA controls all budgets. Under the current structure, the vendor runs the T&D system. Under the new structure, the vendor and LIPA will jointly run the T&D system subject to the LIPA-controlled budget. Under the current structure, the vendor owns the critical computer systems like billing, customer management, and outage management, and the vendor decides on when to upgrade and replace those. Under the new structure, LIPA will own the critical computer systems, and LIPA will decide when to upgrade or replace those. Under the current structure, LIPA has limited say in senior management personnel assignment. Under the new structure, LIPA has approval rights for senior management and broad rights for replacing management personnel. Under the current structure, LIPA has no say in the location of provider jobs. Under the new structure, LIPA can insist that jobs be located on Long Island. Under the current structure, there's no method for setting performance-based financial incentives. Under the new structure, LIPA can set and change performance targets to financially incentivize desired outcomes. Under the current structure, LIPA has little visibility on vendor costs. Under the new structure, there'll be a pass-through cost system which will allow LIPA to know the costs and better set budgets. Under the current structure, there's a 10-year base contract. Under the new structure, LIPA can terminate the contract at any time in order to municipalize or privatize. Under the current structure, the vendor keeps all the cost savings. Under the new structure, LIPA and ratepayers will keep the cost savings, and the vendor has to hit the budget goals to be eligible for performance pay. Under the current structure, the vendor profit is built in and unknown. Under the new structure, LIPA will know exactly what the vendor profit is, and the vendor will have to hit clearly defined benchmarks in order not to be penalized if they don't stay within the LIPA-approved budget. I could go on, but I think that these enhancements and others are an example of what makes the ServCo structure more transparent, more accountable, and more adaptive than LIPA's current structure. As ratepayers and as members of this board, we are confident in and agree with the Brattle Group's recommendation to change LIPA's structure to the service provider model, taking advantage of municipal financing and taking advantage of the expertise and incentive structure of an experienced private utility operator. We believe that this is the best path forward on behalf of our fellow ratepayers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.